Hi, Mage fans. This is Terry Robinson with Mage the Podcast, and today I have not one, not two, but three guests joining me in our not actually existent studio to discuss Mage the Awakening, also known as Mage. That's going to get terribly confusing as things go. I am joined by many of the cast members of Occultists Anonymous, which is a delightful live play of Mage the Awakening, which is approaching 100 episodes, and by the time this is out, they'll probably be at about 300 episodes because there's sometimes a pretty big delay between us recording these things and putting them out. Would you please introduce yourselves?
I'm Drew. I run the show. I'm the storyteller, unless you're actually watching right now while we're recording, in which case that's Chris's problem.
It's true. I'm Chris. I play Songbird on the show, and I'm right now running a short arc set in my hometown of Richmond, Virginia.
And I'm Frank, and I play Weird the Seer.
Nice. So what gave you the idea to do a live play?
There was nothing for Awakening on YouTube.
Why Mage the Awakening?
At least for me, this is all my fault, is the fact that, like, Mage had the sheer open, like, do what you want, which I know, like, Ascension has. But when I look up Mage and I look up latest, I got Awakening. And that was the new one, and that was the one that had just come out and had books coming out. So I'm like, oh, this is clearly the one. And at the time, I had no idea. Like, I saw there was a difference between Ascension and Awakening, but I saw the 20th anniversary, and I was like, oh, this is just like somebody collated the books all together into one big book, not realizing that there's still more anniversary books coming out.
And that's an entirely good reason. I run into my fair share of people who are like, oh, Mage the Awakening must be the new version. And just to kind of cut off a bunch of questions, we are not here to necessarily do a direct compare and contrast. Hopefully we will talk to a developer who has worked on both lines at some point. They can maybe give us some behind the scenes information. Josh Heath did an interview with Bill Bridges talking about some of the early versions of Mage the Awakening and neat little bits like how Atlantis was supposed to just be a stand-in for literally every culture's idea that there used to be something great and then we ruined it. But they removed all the other mentions of things like Shangri-La and Zenmu and so on, but they just never got around to removing Atlantis. So it kind of stuck. But anyway, we hope to join and talk about those things at a later date. Dumb question. What do you play in Mage the Awakening?
Mage the Awakening is about people that have awakened and seen past the lie of the fallen world. It's a little bit of Matrixy. You know, you're realizing that there is more to the world than what you've lived your entire life. And you have developed the ability to cast spells and change the world, and depending on the type of character that you want to play, you're either fighting against these cosmic gods of oppression, or you're making yourself very wealthy by serving them.
Or, technically, keeping your head down and just doing your own thing and trying not to get caught up in everything.
True.
But there is some sort of giant background conflict that you can avail yourself to, or you can stick to your knitting. So it gives you that option. Now, you mentioned the phrase the lie. In the game, the lie is capital L lie, and fallen world is capital F, capital W. What do those terms specifically mean?
The lie specifically is we'll use the term anyways. The veil is, or the lie is the veil that is pulled over the eyes of literally every mortal, and they stop. I don't think believing in magic is accurate. I think they stop being aware of magic. The idea that the exarchs, who are big bad douchebags who climbed the celestial ladder, claimed power, and then broke the ladder beneath them and said, "Oh, this is ours. We're not sharing." Threw the lie over everybody, and now, save for the few that awaken, they just don't perceive magic. They don't realize that, you know, these impossible things are actually possible. And the fallen world is basically this side of that veil, this side of the lie.
So from what I was able to gather, there was some sort of connection between the realm that magic came from and our world in what is the greatest cosmic dick move of all time. People took the magic ball and then they broke the ladder to get to the magic ball. I mixed metaphors there and I shouldn't have. What was that realm of magic, and is it still there, or are we just getting kind of a pale imitation of it when someone awakens to the lie?
Yeah, so that is the supernal. It is the cosmic place of ultimate truth, I think is a pretty good way to describe it. You have things that exist there that are capital S symbols. They're the purest representation of a thing. It is why the exarchs, the big cosmic douchebags that we mentioned, are so powerful, is that they are literally the symbol of oppression through violence or oppression through greed. It is still there when you awaken, when a mage awakens. They basically, there are watchtowers. These watchtowers call out to a person who is awakening and provide them a safe channel to the supernal, and they end up going through various tasks and journeys and eventually carve their name into the watchtower and join as a newly awakened mage.
How literal are these watchtowers? Literally, is there some kind of structure, and do you get like a shank and be like, Terry was here, and carve that into a side of a watchtower? The watchtower is different. Tell me about the watchtowers.
They're open to interpretation, I guess is the best way to put that. The book suggests that there are some people who literally travel in their mystery play, which is part of the awakening process. And they eventually do make their way through whatever obstacles, and they go to the big shining tower, and they literally scratch their name onto it.
So it's not necessarily carving your name. It could be writing in a book or signing a scroll, or it's kind of personal and also tainted by or reflected by the watchtower that you're part of.
Just to throw a character that we actually had in our show, his awakening was where a lot of people had this whole mystery play and they travel through stuff. It all happened in his head in just seconds, and the end of a dreamlike sequence, he signed a book with a gunshot. It was weird.
As you do.
Yeah, as you do. And so it had some actual effect in the real world. But yeah, he put his name in a book by shooting it. That was his way of making his mark. I think one of the examples in the book is actually somebody digging and digging and digging and finding the base of some ancient structure and writing their name on that for the Stygian Moros Necromancer Tower. So yeah, depending on which particular path and how you awaken, very, very different ways of seeing the watchtower. And you only get the one view of it, so enjoy it while it lasts.
Okay. That's kind of a one-shot thing. You see it during awakening. It's not like you go back there and hang with your buds at a later time. No. Okay.
You sure wish you could.
Okay.
Yes.
So there's this brief moment where you have access to the supernal during the awakening. There are these watchtowers. You carve your name in it. From the sounds of things, you don't get to pick. Like, it's not like there's like a sorting hat for watchtowers or something like that, and you're like, nope, you're going to the one in the back, the green one.
Yeah, there's not really any character agency, although the themes and your personality has a lot to do with what watchtower you might match up well to. The incredibly focused on desires and knowing how people work and figuring out their brains, like the overly inquisitive psychiatrist might awaken as a mastigos, where they get space magic to learn about the connections between people, and mind magic to literally look at memories and control people's brains and stuff.
You have these 5 paths that are reflected of personality. That is just something about you. This is a New World of Darkness game, and in New World of Darkness games, you also have usually what's referred to as a Y-splat. You have one thing, which is what you are, and then you have another splat or group that is more voluntary, that is maybe your outlook on some aspect of the supernatural world or what you consider your role in the game to be. Does Awakening have an analog?
I think that would be the orders.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So can we get a quick tour then of the paths and the orders, like a 1 sentence or 2 sentence for those?
So I think the quick breakdown is you're going to have the Pentacle orders, which are the Adamantine Arrow, who believe in service and protection, and they are your badass fighter types.
Conflict is growth.
Mm-hmm. They lean into that stuff, which obviously means punchy, stabby stuff, but can also mean debate and, challenge. I think one of their actual oaths and guidelines is let no throne go unchallenged or some shit like that.
That sounds intense.
You've got the Mysterium, who are super nerdy book folks who want to collect magic things and keep them away from sleepers, because sleepers being near magic, just like in Ascension, is bad and causes paradox and makes magic kind of deteriorate. But they also, on the flip side, are the Indiana Jones types who are digging into ancient tombs or going and stealing stuff from museums because it doesn't belong in that museum, it belongs in my museum. You have the Guardians of the Veil, who are the secret police and martyrs of the Pentacle Order. They basically keep an eye on everybody else, make sure that they're not trucking with the abyss and taking care of their own souls. But if somebody has to die or something terrible has to be done, they're the ones who go, cool, we'll do it. The Silver Ladder are the organizers, leaders, and basically believe that mages should be in charge. I think a benevolent magocracy would be like their happy joy world where mages are in charge and they're grand sorcerer kings that are,
Kings, for sure.
Philosopher kings, yes, that's the term I'm looking for. Served by the sleepwalkers, who are guys who are kind of in between mages and sleepers, and they care for the sleepers, which is kind of this is the good side of the scary mirror, which is the Seers of the Throne, who serve the exarchs and basically do whatever they want and are all about oppressing sleepers and stuff like that. Whoops. Did that out of order because we missed one of the Pentacle Orders, which is
Free Council.
The Free Council, who are not a Diamond Order, but they're part of the Pentacle, and they're the folks who are like, humanity is magic, and they draw heavily on the idea of sleepers being very, very interesting and good, and actually have a touch, there's a little drop there of technocracy in them, that they believe that if magic is introduced slowly enough and carefully enough to the masses, that maybe they'll believe that it's real and doable, and it won't cause dissonance and quiescence and all the bad things that come with sleepers when they see magic.
And earlier you were talking about the paths. Are those things easily summarizable? Like the ones you listed seem to be like almost political views of how people interface with magic and then with sleepers. What about the paths?
Yeah, the paths are more fundamental, sort of how everyone follows a certain path. Even seers, like they cross all of the other boundaries. And Acanthus has the witchy fate time vibe to them. That's where the strings are. They can branch out, of course, but that's where their focus is. Catharsis is all about the spirit world and harnessing that kind of magic and that kind of stuff.
As well, Catharsis is life and spirit magic. Shamans is a good kind of pull single word for them. You have Obrimos, which are tied to the Aether and all about like faith and also like scientific discovery, like the machinations of the world, giant like mandalas and the way the world fits together perfectly. They have prime magic and forces as well. And then I mentioned Mystigos earlier with mind and space. They're the warlocks. Oh, and Moros, the necromancer type earlier, but also they have matter magic. So they're the crafters and the
alchemists.
The alchemists.
So it sounds like a few different, let me say, real-world magical traditions are kind of brought together to make each one of those. And it's kind of a broad classification. And then you have that X group, you have that Y group. Are there any other large-scale sects in the game? You've made mention to the Exarchs. Do they have an organization that they lead, or are they more of an idea? Is there an Exarch inside every one of us?
Yeah, well, the Seers of the Throne are the ones who serve the Exarchs. And so that's a broad category, the way that the Pentacle Order covers the 5 good guys. The Seers of the Throne are broken down into ministries.
Just want to say good guys is in heavy quotes there, right?
Yeah.
Yes. The Seers of the Throne have different ministries. There are some like greater ministries and lesser ministries. A lot of them are focused around one particular exarch, where they will be serving like the Paternoster, serve the Father, and that's oppression through religion. But there's other lesser ministries that may actually do work for 2 exarchs at the same time and pushing both their particular kind of overlaps and stuff like that. So they have it's called the Iron Pyramid, and so just there's any number of different ministries, and so invariably there's might be a smaller one down that serves like 4 or 5 of them, And then there's the gate, but we don't talk about the gate.
So what's the gate?
Right. The gate is the last exarch that none of them want to talk about, because basically each exarch is tied to an arcana, except for the gate, who isn't tied to an arcana, but is tied to the abyss. And part of the whole breaking the celestial ladder was they moved the abyss, which is the big nebulous unreality that surrounded our world and the supernal world, and they basically shifted everything over. They put the abyss between our world and the supernal world, and that was their way of cutting everybody off from magic until the Watchtowers did their thing. And so it is the exarch that nobody worships, nobody serves, nobody does that, but there are definitely those who serve it. And they're, I don't know, I've actually not read any books that really talk about who serves the gate, but there's definitely some who do, and they're probably a little messed up.
And you mentioned that there hasn't been much on it, but at this point, how many books are in the Awakening 2E line?
3, right?
3.
Yeah,
we
the
just
core,
had...
signs, and nameless and accursed. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a 1E that came before that has a bunch of informations that you can choose to take or leave, I imagine, just like every role-playing game, but we're pretty well sticking with 2E for the purpose of this conversation, except for maybe a few bits and bobs.
Yeah.
Are there any other large or refined magical societies? I read a little bit about legacies or groups of legacies. What are those?
So legacies are a group and a philosophy of mages that think the same about magic and form a codified set of praxis spells, very specific modified spells that they all agree this is what we can do, and this is how we think about magic, this is what we do to obtain mana and stuff like that. And it literally becomes, once you become initiated, it actually changes your soul. You become aligned so closely to these symbols that you can just do these spells. You don't have to cast them, you can just do them. For example, my character Songbird is a Forge Master, which is, all about looking at the way things are put together and just glancing at something, at a tool that someone has made, and being able to know more about the person that made it and stuff like that. And then at higher levels of the legacy, being able to just create whatever material that I need at the moment.
Out of pure mana, I might add.
Pure mana, yeah.
One of the really cool things about legacies, they obviously give you ways to get mana, which is kind of like quintessence from Ascension. It's the thing that you make super cool spells go, and it helps you fight Paradox back. But legacies, all the different praxes, which the game calls attainments, they come from your soul as opposed to being drawn down from supernal symbols across the abyss. As such, there's no paradox involved with them. They have very, very controlled specific things, but if Songbird conjures a sword, a glowing sword out of mana, he can just hand that off to his sleeper buddy and say, here, defend yourself. And the sleeper buddy is probably going to stare and go, what? But is totally cool and will remember this for the rest of their life, as opposed to forgetting that they ever saw magic literally at the end of the scene.
It seems like a legacy in that case is almost like a school in the European sense, that you are a member of this particular group who has this particular world outview that is much more refined, and apparently it is a refinement to the point where it literally modifies your soul. One of the things that's interesting is in Mage, we usually don't use the S word. We don't use the term soul. It may exist. People theorize about it, but generally we talk about the avatar, that little shard of divinity or creation that allows you to enact magic, or the other entity within your body, this kind of higher essence that allows you to manipulate the world around you. So it sounds like magic can come from one of two sources. One, it can be drawn down by invoking these supernal symbols. Two, it can come from your soul. What else does the soul do in the game? Are there mechanics for them?
Yeah, so
Yes.
it's actually kind of goes across a lot of different Chronicles of Darkness stuff, that there's various different splats that touch on pieces of understanding about the soul. As far as Mage is concerned, the soul interacts in a few different ways. Number one is that everyone's soul has a shard of the abyss in it, which is why you struggle to do magic, and the paradox is generated around you when you do magic. It is tied into willpower. If you do not have a soul, if your soul is removed, you lose all your willpower and have generally a bad time. But souls are very wishy-washy, I think is maybe a way to put it. If you lose your soul and then someone helps you out by just putting someone else's soul in you, eventually your consciousness and your body and your spirit will kind of subsume the differences of that soul, and you'll be back to normal, quote unquote normal.
Yeah, I was to say air quotes.
Souls are weird. Mages have spent a lot of time in universe studying them and trying to figure out how to make a soul, and theoretically they're comprised of all of the 5 subtle arcana, so fate, prime, mind, death, and spirit.
Sure.
But even someone that has mastered all 5 of those arcana has not been able to create a soul.
Okay, so it sounds like there are certain things beyond the purview of the magic system as presented, and one of those things is soulcraft, it seems. But it's good to know that if I lose mine, I can go down to Souls R Us, get one, go on anti-rejection meds for a couple of months, maybe see a doctor and avoid rigorous exercise, and I should be good in a bit. That's neat.
Actually, that does remind me of, outside of our Pentacle and Seers and stuff like that, we do have like some of the various bad guy folks who are really bad. One of them is the Tremere Liches. And no, they're not vampires, except that they kind of are, in the fact that they extend their lives out by, stealing souls and nomming on them. And they have a whole set of different extra mechanics. They're technically mages. They basically say, screw the supernal. We're going to do everything by basically harnessing souls and ripping them out of people. They're no bueno, but yet they literally generate stuff via soul power.
You've made mention of the Seers as being, quote unquote, the bad guys, or from their perspective, they probably think they're perfectly fine. Are there any other groups of mages that are in some way bad, either amoral or have fallen from some sort of path or have received some sort of taint? In Mage the Ascension, we have the Nefandi, which have sold out to demonic powers in some way or just want to see the destruction of everything, and the Marauders, who have kind of gone mad in some way, shape, or form. Are there fallen mages or deranged or demented mages that are a distinct group or that maybe even have systems behind them?
Mage has, actually, the book we mentioned, Nameless and Accursed, just came out, kind of goes over a lot of these systems. And so one of the big ones, Pentacle Society in general has a term called left-handed, which is anyone that is using magic in a way out there, and it can be politically motivated, but immoral way. Generally, this is ways that people are trying to extend their life supernaturally. It includes liches of various sorts. There are mages called the Celesti, which are basically paradox mages.
They're pretty close to the Nefandi.
Yeah.
As I understand it.
They gain more power by infecting the world with the abyss, doing all sorts of nasty stuff with that. You also have things like the Rapt, which are mages whose souls have broken open by losing all of their wisdom. They're so obsessed with their obsessions with the things that they're trying to accomplish that they have lost all sense of reality, and their magic literally leaks and infects the world out of their soul.
A quick one, Banishers. Kind of tweaked mages who basically either they had a very, very bad awakening to the point that they come out and instead of having wisdom and therefore are immune to breaking points and bad stuff from magic, some come out still have integrity, which is the base morality stat for humans. So everything they do magically causes them pain. And because they have mage sight, because they've been awakened, they see all the magic, they go nuts, they're not having a good time, and they try to kill all the mages, and they have a whole anti-mage thing. Or that's the Herod. And then you have the regular Banishers, who are just mages who think, you know what, there needs to be less mages. End of Doctor Strange, Baron
Mordo.
Oh, Mordo, thank you. Who is like, yeah, the world would be better with less sorcerers. He's a Banisher.
What is the relationship then with between mages and other supernatural creatures? In Mage the Ascension, mages are kind of liminal characters. They can kind of go just about anywhere and deal with just about anyone. Are there other supernatural entities that are like playable lines that mages in general will encounter? Do they truck with vampires or werewolves or Prometheans or what have you?
Where's Ash, right?
Right.
And we're laughing because as you're saying that, you're basically checking off things we've done.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. In short, Chronicles of Darkness in general handles crossover very, very well. where all else fails and you can't decide whose power actually works. You roll a Clash of Wills. It's a game mechanic that lets you decide, okay, well, at this time, this power wins out over this power as long as it's still active. The other power isn't gone necessarily. It's just not necessarily working. So you can be invisible as a vampire with obfuscate or something like that. And the mage uses mage sight and goes, I see you, and you roll a Clash of Wills. That helps out that. But yeah, mages in general can interact with a lot of the splats. They are very, very liminal. They're one of the few who can go to the shadow, which is our version of the Umbra that werewolves hang out in. They can go into the underworld, which is very Geist, Sin Eaters, dead folks stuff. And then you have the astral realm, which is sort of a mage only thing, except that's also where beasts are kind of hanging out. And not to mention, obviously, hey, the vampire who lives right next door, all that stuff is very there and approachable. And depending on what kind of mage you are, you might try and experiment with them or try and learn from them and dissect them. Or you pull in Ash, who is our other player and who just wants to hug everybody and get everybody to get along and hang out together, depending on, what kind of person you're playing.
You've mentioned Mage Sight a couple of times. What is that?
Oh, man. So it is a very personal filter that you can see the world through, that you see symbols of things that are around you and magic that is around you. For Songbird, who is a Norwegian MMA fighter before Awakening, everything is sort of painted with the brush of Norse gods. So there's a lot of, he'll hear a little bit of chanting and go into a berserker rage a little bit when seeing magic and when casting magic. But it is it's also tied into the paths. There are sort of underlying similarities that each mage of a path sees. The Mastigos, for in general, all of them will see little devils on, that make up people, and their various different vices and thoughts and everything like that.
It's very particular to the path and lets you see and sense different supernatural effects, whether it's magical or magic, Magick in the Ascension terms, or even just supernatural effects from werewolves or vampires or things like that, depending on which arcana you're activating with your mage sight.
Okay, so it's a case where I can use it as traditional Mage Dark to detect mage effects, but I may also be able to pick up on one of the Fallen or one of the Unchained or something, or one of their effects, depending on that lens.
Correct.
Mm-hmm. Are you stuck with one at that point, or is that tied to the arcana? Is it a universal ability, as in will everyone see everything? It just kind of looks a little bit different?
Basically, you activate which arcana you want to view through by default, as you have two ruling arcana from your path. So Thyrsis has life and spirit. They can activate that for free. But if our good Thyrsis buddy has also been studying some death, then he can throw on death, but that's going to cost him a mana. So he has to kind of reach out a little bit extra to actually have that. But then he could see life, spirit, and death all at the same time. He would be completely blind to magical mind effects in that particular example.
And there's one distinction we didn't touch on. There's a difference between active mage sight and passive mage sight.
Mm-hmm.
Because everyone has sort of a peripheral mage sight when there's wonky things going on around you. Like in Weird's case, she hears the giggling of little fairy to alert her that there's something hunky going on, and maybe she wants to turn on her active mage sight to investigate it further.
Okay, so it sounds like that basic mage sight is kind of similar to the awareness trait in Old World of Darkness. Is there also an awareness trait that just lets you pick up on general kookiness, or is mage sight pretty well how that happens?
For Chronicles of Darkness, there is an unseen sense merit that you can pick for specific things. So you could pick vampires or werewolves or mages, and that will give you, a little tingle that, hey, something is going on here. But for mages, just flat out, if there is something supernatural at all, they immediately are aware of it. They're aware something is happening. They don't know where, they don't know what, they just know it's somewhere.
Okay, so this isn't necessarily a universal spider sense.
No.
You've made mention of mana before, and one of the key differences between the two systems is kind of the treatment of mage gas. Where does mana come from?
So mana kind of filters down from the supernal. Little bits of it sneak through the abyss. and it can leak into the world through pooling up and forming a hallow, which are, kind of Mage the Awakening definitely focuses on, ley lines and resonance and stuff like that of the world. So, for example, in our sanctum, we have, which is where we, all do our magic and kind of live, and not necessarily live, but hang out in our base of operations. We have a hallow that is tied to the resonance of creativity and production, because it's in our forge, and so all of the mana that collects there is tied to that sort of feeling and resonance.
So mana collects in certain places. It has a flavor to it of some sort. Does it ever come in like a solidified form? In Mage the Ascension, we have the idea of TAS, which is quintessence that's taken on physical form. Does mana?
Hey, we use the same word. That's our word.
Yeah.
There's TAS, which only shows up in Hallows, or if you have your friendly local Prime Mage put mana into something, it'll appear in objects that are in the environment. If you're in a deep underground Hallow, you might get magic forming in like these cool gemstone geodes, or if you're building a bakery right over your hallow that you've secured for your cabal, then you might literally end up with magical bread that you can just eat to get mana back.
It feels to me like the game is this mix of like Platonism and Gnosticism, in the idea that there are truer truths out there that something has prevented us from seeing. Are these symbols visual? Are there other embodiments of them? Do they have any analogs in human history? Like when you say symbol, what does that mean?
It's symbol in the very like metaphysical, and I mean, you touched on Gnosticism. That is the kind of central theme that every game of Mage the Awakening centers on. And you have a stat called Gnosis, right? It is the collection of the way that you understand how magic interacts with the world and what you can do with your magic. How you can tear apart the lie in specific ways to do what you need to do.
So some embodiments of that symbol may be auditory, some may be written, some may be some other idea. It's not specifically like, I drew a thing.
Right.
It's always going to be a metaphysical thing that you are drawing down. That's so. For instance, if our good friend Songbird wants to, affect fire in the forge that he's working on, he's drawing on the supernal symbol of fire that's back there in the supernal realm, crossing through the abyss and dragging that into this real world to manipulate it.
When you awaken, you do this voyage to the Watchtower. How do you then join Mage Society?
When you awaken, you literally set off a giant beacon, depending on the person listening, their gnosis, to a number of miles. So it is possible, if you awaken out in, the middle of nowhere, you might awaken, become magical, start experimenting with these new powers, and have no idea what is going on because nobody was around. But generally speaking, you're going to be somewhere, there's going to be some mage, or heck, there's some mage somewhere that's using fate magic to know when you're going to awaken, or somebody does awaken. They just happen to be there at the right time because fate magic is dumb. I love you, Craig. Those happen, but there are 3 orders that are very, very into awakenings, controlling them, knowing about them, and recruiting them. The Guardians of the Veil create labyrinths where they basically give people bullshit, and if they see through the bullshit, they're like, cool, we're going to show you more bullshit until you finally awaken, and they basically keep down anybody they think is not worthy of magic, and will use them as like, though they do cults and stuff like that, and send them on suicide missions. And there are some good sides of the labyrinth too, but generally speaking, it's a big test, and if they survive, then they're going to become a mage. The Silver Ladder does cryptopolies, which are about making mage and sleeper life better. And they have big, widespread tendrils where they're nudging things. They'll nudge this politician. They'll try and arrange this marriage. They'll do all sorts of stuff like that. And as people notice, hey, when I did this thing for that one guy, all of a sudden I got a promotion at work and all these different things. And once they start to notice those connections, good, you've noticed. Here, read some of these really weird books and we'll give you more. And they incrementally introduce them into mage society, even if they're not actually awakened. There are some members of awakened magical society on the pentacle side who are completely sleepers. They have no ability to do magic. They just understand my boss goes into that room and comes back out. He turned lead into gold. I don't know how. I didn't see it, but now I have this, giant, block of gold where he had just lead. Magic definitely happened. I just didn't see it, and I'm not part of that. And so that's their thing, to try and nudge and encourage awakenings. And then, of course, there's the Seers of the Throne, who really, really hate people awakening because that's more mages doing stuff. But if you're going to awaken, we're going to recruit you and put you to work.
How hot is the war between the Seers and the Pentacle?
There are plenty of occasions where Seers and Pentacle have worked together against a bigger threat. For example, in Abyssal Incursion, Seers and Pentacle may cooperate because they recognize that that's an existential threat to everybody. So it is possible to have truces and cooperation, but kind of never really long term. I mean, the Seers exist to oppress people, and that's not really...
Okay. So it sounds like they are more adversarial than two political parties, but maybe less adversarial than two nations at war.
I think that's pretty accurate. It is very Cold War. They work around each other. Notably,
lots of spies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, lots of spies, lots of infiltration. The Seers of the Throne, because of the whole pyramid idea, you have a lot of infighting and backstabbing. And I think Dave Brookshaw, who's the big 2E writer, basically has stated, yes, the Seers of the Throne could totally win this war if they weren't constantly fighting and inner turmoil.
Yeah, that's kind of a recurring theme in a lot of cases in Mage the Ascension. The technocrats could probably wipe out the traditions if they ignored every other goal. And the Fondi could probably triumph if they weren't all fighting each other to be the first to destroy humanity. So that's interesting. So let me just see if I have this so far. You are a human or a being or an entity of some sort that has been tapped or realized that the reality that you have is just a pale imitation of some truer reality or some external reality, and that by manipulating your connection with that, you can call upon that other reality to change the world around you in large ways. It does not necessarily tie to any extant human magical belief or practice, although it seems like in some cases that can be the lens or that can be a particular kind of refinement that is placed on top of that. The juice for that is mana, and it represents dribs and drabs that have come through from the supernal through the abyss and hit the fallen world. There is a fight, a political argument over what the relationship between magic and the rest of humanity should be, and then there's an assortment of bad people trying to use things for their own ends or trying to eat your soul.
Yeah,
pretty accurate. Yeah.
Just making sure I got the broad strokes. How do you learn to magic gooder?
That's actually one of my favorite things in Mage. Mechanically, there are things called arcane beats that you get from doing lots of stuff. Did you summon a supernal being across the abyss and are chatting with him, and this is the first time you've ever met a shade of death or a seraphim from the Aether? Cool, take an arcane beat. Is this the first time you've seen and really studied a particular magical effect, or a vampire's obfuscation, or a changeling's goblin contract? Cool, take an arcane beat. All of those add up to more and more experiences that you then internalize and go, okay, let me just, and your arcana increases.
Okay, so this is a case where you have two sets of experience points that you can accumulate. You have standard beats, and then you have these arcane beats, which, I mean, I'd love to see them in concert sometime after the pandemic passes.
Killer tofu.
Exactly. And it's interesting in that, to the surprise of no one, a decently arranged system would have it so that investigating magic can make you magic gooder, as opposed to in Old World of Darkness, where it's like, my girlfriend just dumped me, but I got emotional closure, which is why I can now throw fireballs. Great. It also sounds like that encourages kind of exploration and experimentation, that the game rewards you for kind of stepping outside your character's possible comfort zone. Is that generally how it manifests? Does it create curiosity and wanderlust of, yeah, I want to see a werewolf, it might kill me, but I'll magic with her?
I'd say that's the main thing about mages is every mage is going to be curious. Every mage is going to want to explore and see new things. And there always this hunger for new information and learning new things. That's what sort of defines somebody being a mage. It's kind of part and parcel with the magical ability and seeing through the lie is this curiosity to explore things that were hidden from you before you awoke.
Yeah. And I think one of the big things, especially between, and I like how this actually works in universe, but because PCs players are actually out and doing stuff, they're more likely to see these things, interact with these things, cast a new spell for the first time, etc. Whereas your more sedate and chilling, kind of established mages have already gone out and done that. They don't need to go see this thing or that thing. They've been there, they've done that. So now they're off in more esoteric stuff, or they're trying to craft this new thing that's tied to their particular obsession. And that's where their arcana and arcane XP is going to come from, as opposed to, players are out and doing stuff, and actually acts of hubris. Every time you provoke an act of hubris, regardless if you pass or fail the roll, which that's a whole thing, you get an arcane beat. So if you want to really accelerate how much you're learning, just go make acts of hubris and hope you don't become one of the wrapped and tank your wisdom.
If we don't tie the act of magic to paradigms as they do in Mage the Ascension, what does magic as it's being cast look like? What are the side effects outside of the spell itself on the world? Are there external signs that you are a mage? Do you have any sort of signature that you leave with your effect? Do you get this aura of flame when you're casting? What other dribs and drabs occur metaphysically when you magic?
So there's a couple of things there that you're kind of branching into. One is that the act of casting a spell itself is very, very personal. And in Mage the Awakening, we talk about something called an imago. And that's the image you have in your head of how a spell will be executed and the effect that it will have. And that's all very personal. It's based on your life history and your personality and your path as well. But there's also something called your nimbus, which is when you're working magic, the sort of the bleed off from you that manifests in the world for those with the ability to see it. And the signature that you leave behind when you've worked magic in a place or on a thing or on a person. So those are kind of three different things, but the nimbus is kind of the visual representation that people can see, but the imago is how people form their spells and cast them.
And a quick note here, the Nimbus is only going to be seen by other mages who are even using Mage Sight. It is completely possible to walk by another mage who's casting a spell, and if they're not using yantras and these different tools or motions or anything like that, and your peripheral Mage Sight goes off, says something supernatural just happened, you can look around and you would not necessarily know that the guy that you just walked by was actually casting a mind spell that is letting him think about two things at once.
Okay, so it's not always the case that there's a lot of metaphysical exhaust that someone can pick up on.
Mm-hmm.
The mechanical side of it is that the bigger the magic, the more potent the magic that you're creating, the longer your nimbus lasts on either the area or the thing that you're casting on. And there's also a part of the nimbus called a long-term nimbus, which is that the higher your gnosis, the more established and powerful of a mage you are, your parts of your nimbus leak out into the world along your connections and to the people that you're most closely associated with and the places you're most closely associated with. For Songbird, who is very much aligned with the symbols of kind of being a Valkyrie and a leader of a Norse tribe kind of thing, these are the branches of Yggdrasil reaching into the world and reaching out towards the people that they are connected to.
So then how does that literally manifest, though, with those that you are close to? In Ascension, we have the idea of resonance, that a mage of a particular type, after a certain amount, someone who is prone to control weather when they get angry, little bits of static electricity may literally course across their hair as they rage. Are there analogs here that bleed out into the world, or again, is it a strictly metaphysical phenomenon that's only visible to other mages?
It can definitely appear physically. The character that I'm playing, Chris running it, his long-term nimbus is, now he's not powerful enough that it matters right now. But just because he's big into community and people interacting and a whole idea of confess, basically people around him will spontaneously confess crimes, sins, big air quotes there, that they have done to their loved ones or to their community. That guilt just builds up, and they just tell people things, and for whatever reason, just that guilt and stuff like that. So it can, but it only happens to those, at least of his wisdom, to his strong connections or places that he has strong connection to. So it's not necessarily going to be a physical thing, though in the case of like Songbird, like, man, why do we keep getting these weird tree roots coming up through the concrete?
And that seems to lean into another thing in New World of Darkness, the idea that whatever your practice is, it's going to, almost regardless of the line, it's going to heavily influence the people close to you in your life. You've used two terms referring to something that seemed like magical power. One was gnosis and one was wisdom.
Correct.
What are they?
So gnosis is your, I kind of mentioned it earlier, is the sum total of that sort of Gnostic understanding of how magic works and what you can do with it. It is a stat that starts at 1. You can buy it up as you progress through the game mechanically, and when you the base roll of casting a spell is Gnosis plus an Arcana. You roll that many dice and try and get some successes. And Wisdom starts at 7 as a created character. It is your morality stat, but it's not really morality in the like ethics sense of the word. It's more of, do you understand what using your magic, the ramifications of using your magic, right? So if I use magic to kill someone, like you have to sit down and think like, hey, was this something I should have done? Did I really think this through? And it has a act of hubris roll for committing sins against those wisdoms.
Okay, so it sounds like wisdom represents more of an ethical creed than anything else, almost like humanity and vampire, or adherence to a conviction, or adherence to a road of some sort. And like the other New World of Darkness lines, it is the other morality that you have, and I'm completely blanking on literally what every other game calls theirs. And
integrity or humanity or...
werewolves have harmony.
Which is a sliding scale, which is really cool. Yeah.
I always thought wisdom was like Mage is very much about the resistance of pride and hubris. I mean, you can literally remake reality how you want it to be as a mage, and using that power like carefully and not introducing more of the abyss into the world is sort of the wisdom is your measure of how well you do that.
Especially when you take into consideration that somebody with low or zero wisdom stops having control over their magic. It is a good thing to say that it is, or an accurate thing to say, that it is a self-control meter. The actual written description for Gnosis is so freaking terrific. If anybody, and especially those of you who play other Chronicles of Darkness stuff, but listen, the mage bias about we know everything, it's in the book. No, seriously, listen to this. Have you ever been the expert in a room full of opinionated but uninformed people? Think about the feelings you get when they speak intellectual falsehoods and others agree. Think about the feeling you get when your voice is shouted down by the raw number of other voices. Then think about the feeling you get when your voice begins to click and resonate with the audience and you feel you can make a change to inform, to enlighten them. Multiply those feelings 100-fold and you have an idea of what Gnosis is. A starting mage walks into the room and just listen. I get this. I know what I'm talking about. Just listen to me. And yeah, so like they can't help it. They know better. And that's where that wisdom comes in. That is the thing holding back. Yes, I know better, but how am I actually going to show these people?
So what reins in, then, excessive magical use? You've made mention that sometimes mana is required, which suggests that sometimes mana isn't required. And one of the things that makes the mage game, that made the mage game unique, is there was no real magical gas tank that you had to make sure was full. What prevents you from turning everything around you to gold, if anything, or more, or alternatively, are there systematic ramifications to over-magicking?
Yes. Yeah. So mana is not necessarily a gas tank so much as your catalyst. If you are doing magic out of your ruling arcana, so again, our Thyrsus example, why am I keep talking about Thyrsus? Anyways, life and spirit arcana. If I'm just doing stuff there, I don't use mana. I cast a spell, it goes off, it does things, cool.
Certain
However,
special effects may require mana.
Very true. Yeah. If anything really pushes what you're doing, so for instance, if I'm healing aggravated damage instead of just lethal wounds, in order to actually heal aggravated damage, that's going to require some mana. However, if I go over and I cast a death spell, which is not one of my Thyrsus's ruling arcana, no matter what the spell is, that's going to require mana. And mana is also used to cut down the, as you said, over magicking, the paradox that comes from overreaching and pushing too hard at a spell, even if it's one of my ruling arcana, even if I'm doing life or spirit stuff as my Thyrsus, if I'm reaching really hard and really pushing my ability, I'm going to invoke some paradox, and I can spend mana to kind of buy it off and throw mana at it to kind of plug the holes. And reduce how much paradox is actually going to come through and threaten me.
Is there any sort of magic police or magic laws that are like, hey, don't magic too much?
I guess the Guardians kind of fill that role. If somebody is throwing around too much paradox, putting people at risk, causing risks to their soul, the Guardians kind of step in and eliminate them or take them in hand or however they end up handling it. They're kind of the overwatch of that kind of thing.
Yeah, there's a Lex Magica that the Pentacle follows, these laws of magic, and some of them are like, don't cast magic in front of sleepers, and some various things like that are some blunt, like, hey, don't do this thing because it's bad to you. So most follow those rules, but yeah, when somebody goes really off the deep end, they send the Interfector, who's one of the Guardians, and says, okay, let's get rid of this guy.
Okay, so you've given a pretty good walkthrough of kind of the world in which Mage the Awakening takes place. I'd like to delve into the magic system. So for full disclosure, I got to play in a one-shot that Drew was running.
Fabulous. Oh, dang. Well, now you gave it away.
So, a member of the year who shall remain nameless ran a one-shot in which I participated, and I got to try the Mage the Awakening system and kind of look at the world. I wouldn't quite call it a proper kick the tires because there's only so much you could do. To put my cards on the table, am entirely in favor of metagaming during a one-shot. I don't care what your character should do. We have plot to discover, and I've got systems to look at.
I've got 3 hours. Let's go.
Exactly. How much could this? Well, my character would just go to the library and read. I'm like, I don't care. I want to shoot something. And it was one of those cases where I looked at the magic system, and I'm like, oh man, this is massive, and it is complicated. But then later, I realized, but there's only one of it. Once you get that massive, complicated system, you have the game. The rest of it is just kind of some bits and bobs and like default underlying World of Darkness things. So at one point, I'm like, this is stupid and hard. And I'm like, but Mage the Ascension is stupid and hard. And it's stupid and hard in a bunch of different ways. This is only stupid and hard in one way.
One way.
Can you walk us through the types of spells? Like, I know that the term rote is used. You've mentioned the term praxis and practice. Can you give us kind of an idea of how magic is organized and the types of spells there are?
So a praxis would be a spell that somebody is particularly good at. It's where they got special enhancements, and game mechanic wise, it's a lot easier to get a critical success or an exceptional success when you're casting from a praxis.
It's a bit of a personal spin on doing this particular effect that you figured out. And to go from that to rotes that you mentioned, rotes are codified specific ways to always make sure that you get this effect to happen. Drew mentioned reach earlier. A rote gives you extra reach, which helps you do extra effects, make a bigger spell, make a better spell, make a longer spell. It lets you have the reach as if you were a master of that arcana. Which is very, very good for especially low-level spells or for low Gnosis mages.
And it specifically comes with a rote mudra, which is a type of yantra. Off the top of my head, it is literally the single largest bonus you can add to a spell. Depending on your particular skill, it will go up to 5, but that gives you a huge bonus that you can add to your die pool compared to literally any other yantra, which usually taps out at like 3 or 4.
So that's interesting because in Ascension, pretty well the only dice you ever roll for Mage are strictly going to be your Arete, which seems to be analogous to Gnosis. And now that you can add Gnosis plus Arcana, that you immediately have vastly larger dice pools, which kind of makes sense. Are there any cases where the dice pool gets larger than Gnosis plus Arcana?
Yeah, and that's where your yantras show up, as well as some other tools that you can do. But yeah, yantras are tools that you use to help direct the spell. So rote mudras are mnemonics. They might be hand motions. They might be doing some quick mental calculations or something like that that helps you codify the spell. You may draw on your shadow name, which is very much your persona and the thing that reflects who you are as a spellcaster, as opposed to that mundane person you used to be. In the case of Drifter, who's my Mastigos, he can draw on the rules of the Lex Magica, and if he's doing something to enforce them or is investigating a crime against them or something like that, he can actually call on his Silver Ladder status and how important he is to the Silver Ladder and use that as a yantra. You can call on the fact that, well, the environment is set up and I'm in a lab, in a chemistry lab perhaps, and I'm changing the chemistry of this particular material and I'm turning lead to gold. Even though that's not actual chemistry, I can draw on that little bit of the environment, all those things helping create the spell and bring it into reality. And it taps out technically at +5.
But still, 5 is a lot of dice. That's a hefty maw. You've mentioned a lot of these trappings and raiments of magic, and to me, those super sound like Paradigm from Mage the Ascension. So it sounds like there is still room to say, this is my character, this is the way they view the world, this is the toolbox they use. And because their effect aligns with how culture, or at least they themselves as part of a culture, view the magic they are doing versus the tools they're using to do it, they get a benefit from that. Is that strictly drawing on supernal symbology in some way, or is it metaphysically representative of something else?
So Drew mentioned all these different yantras, and like yantras at their heart are calling on capital S symbols to tie them into your magic. And there definitely is that bit of, this is how I understand the world. This is my, either through religion or philosophy or whatever. And you can call on these. In the mage line, mages know the fallen religions are not true, but that doesn't necessarily take away their power as a symbol. Like we may not believe that, or we may now know that Thor doesn't actually exist as a god in the world, but that doesn't mean that maybe there's some sort of supernal entity out there that is the true Thor, and so you can call on that symbol as part of your casting.
And likewise, a chemistry lab is but a pale imitation of the supernal idea of transformation, but it still gives you enough of, to kind of tap into it. So it sounds like there are a bunch of things where you can be invoking, this is who I am as a person, these are the tools I am using right now, this is the effect I am going for, or this is the result of the effect or the intent of the effect. Can you walk us through casting a spell?
There are quite a number of different practices that exist in the rule set. But as an example, there is one of my favorites is weaving. It is a 3-dot practice. So you have to have 3 dots in the arcana you're going to use. And it allows you to alter any property of a target within that arcana without transforming it into something completely different. For example, Songbird uses life magic to make himself a better fighter. So there is a spell in the book called Honing the Form. It is a life spell to increase your physical stats. So if I was going to start casting that, I would start building my pool of dice with Gnosis plus life. And reach is defined by how much better you are at an arcana, how many more dots of it you have than the spell you're casting. If you have 3 dots and you're casting a 3-dot spell, you get 1 reach for free. Reach is spent by increasing the factors of a spell. Normally, mages have to cast a spell at duration, and it only lasts a single turn, and it only affects one target.
Takes 3 hours.
And it takes, well, for no starting mages, that ritual time is 3 hours. You can spend a reach to make a spell instant cast, but many of the spells have particular individual reach effects, which is where you end up spending a lot and then overreaching and creating paradox and stuff like that. So honing the form normally lets you pick your strength, your dexterity, or your stamina and add some dots to it for the length of the spell. But there is a reach effect that lets you divide the spell's potency, how strong the spell is, how many dots you're going to add between two stats. So you mentioned earlier how these dice pools get out of hand really quickly. So like Songbird could very easily have a dice pool of about 12 or 13 dice, but you're going to need to up the duration so it lasts maybe a week if you would just want to have the spell on for a while. So you can spend 2 of those dice out of your pool to up a step on the duration table. You can add a potency to the spell for that same 2 dice penalty. So that way, instead of just adding 1 dot to your strength, you might add, 4 or 5, and you start tanking that dice pool down to, a more reasonable 5 or 6.
At the end of the day, it does kind of sound like Mage the Ascension, where you are spending, instead of, in Mage the Ascension, you spend successes to change duration, intensity, range, and so on. Here, it sounds like you are spending dice in your dice pool, and if at the end of the day you have any dice left, you roll dem dice, and you get any successes, the whole effect goes off. It doesn't sound like there's much of a partial success system.
No.
Sure.
Yeah. Mage the Awakening First Edition worked on a similar way to Ascension. You roll your whole pool, and however many successes you get, you can kind of allocate them to different things. But Second Edition, I think, is more clean in that you're saying this is the exact effect I'm trying to create. This is the imago. This is the scale, the size, the duration. I'm gonna roll my 3 dice and hope it works.
Yeah.
Right.
And the other thing you mentioned in going through the practices, that sounds like a way of kind of making the arcana more consistent from one to another. Like, so you mentioned weaving with life allows you to increase strength. I imagine weaving with matter allows you to change something's phase. Or make an item maybe magical, or do a slight modification to maybe the tempo of time. So now it makes it easier to look across the different domains of magic and say a 3 dot here and a 3 dot here does the same thing. We're just kind of changing the substrate on which it is being applied.
Correct.
Yeah.
That's the practices, yes.
So we've talked about a bunch of stuff and building effects and the pools and everything. Are there any other neat corners of the system that you're like, oh, this thing is super neat, or this is really clever or well thought out?
Legacy attainments, I think.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. Go ahead, Craig.
So when you're part of a legacy, you've got certain abilities that come with it that mirror spells, and they have built-in reach and built-in conditions. And when you construct those, if you're building a custom legacy, for example, you're basically just building a spell. So it includes reach for different areas of effect or extra potency or that kind of thing. The neat thing about those is they never trigger paradox, and you can build them so that they're instant cast. So, for example, Weird has the ability to, because she's devoted herself to this legacy, she can open up scry windows on her Cabal mates for free, essentially. Just toss them up there's no rolls involved, it just happens. And so she can keep an eye on all of her Cabal mates to make sure that they're safe, and if they need help, she can, that kind of thing. Songbird has one where he could pick up an item and just know a lot about that item as part of an attainment that comes with that legacy.
And for me, the big thing is the actual making of legacies. They're very, very easy to do. It's similar to the magic system itself, in the fact that once you understand how to make them, you can go hog wild and make tons of them. They're very straightforward. It just takes a minute to read the rules and actually believe that you can do this. You really can. They're probably the closest you get to Paradigm, because they bring in oblations, which are special ways to get mana back without actually needing a hallow, like in the case of Songbird, and being a smith, Forge Master, can literally smith some stuff in, like literally just work at a forge. Congratulations, you get some mana back. In the case of the Ebon Phoenix, which is the one I made, can literally do a Sudoku puzzle. Cool, I get some mana back. It's limited. It's not like you can sit there and go through the entire Sudoku book and get tons of mana. But over the course of a couple days, you could probably fill your mana pool back up. And all that together is the best way to be like, and this is my mage doing my stuff my way. That's your big, like, my stamp on the world kind of stuff, because paths and orders, you kind of follow the established rules that are there, and the established, orders are obviously literally going to kind of drive who you are in society a little bit. But legacy says, yeah, I might be an adamantine arrow, but I'm a tamer of fire, and I will literally throw fireballs, and nobody cares. Nobody can stop me, because they can't be counterspelled. They don't provoke paradox. As long as I'm messing with these particular spells, I can do whatever I want.
My personal favorite thing is the supernal summoning.
That was the next thing I was going to get to. Yeah.
Yep.
So once you have 3 dots in one of your ruling arcanas, for Songbird it was Forces or Prime, you can summon through these like big, long, hours long rituals. You can create a sort of tunnel through the abyss to bring forth a creature, a capital S symbol, forward from the supernal for a while, protect them in the fallen world. Doing this can get some really cool benefits from them, but they always ask you to submit to a trial. An example from the show is that the first thing I summoned was the intersection between knowledge and desire.
That was a proper name, by the way.
It was a sort of giant man covered in like ritually scarred eyes all over his body.
And like 9 feet tall.
Yeah, and like 9 feet tall. Being able to use him to track down a magical grimoire that we were looking for, because he had space and prime symbols. But he asked me to get past him.
Which he did, physically.
Every path has 2 different types of supernals that they can summon, and there is tons of really good flavor inspiration in the rule books for them, as well as in Signs of Sorcery, which is the book that came out, I think, last year?
Yep.
Yeah, like last summer. It added boons that you can ask of the various different supernals, which are all really fascinating.
Very fascinating, and notably very, very different from one another. So, for instance, like in the case of Songbird summoning a prime and space angel, big 9 foot tall cherubim can provide one particular type of boon. But if I summoned, as my Mastigos, a space and prime demon, they would have very different boons. And some of them are super, super cool, and you're like, hell yeah, I want to use that all the time. And then others are like, man, I hope I never need to do that.
But it gives you a way to do summoning, which in Mage the Ascension would generally require the spirit sphere and kind of cut down the domain that you could draw on. When you said cherubim, do you mean a giant Raphaelite baby or the 4-winged, 3-headed entities of the Old Testament?
Yes.
Okay.
So in the book, they definitely mention what the various supernal beings usually look like, but I'll be honest, that's kind of boring. So I tend to flavor them off of, also like in the case of Songbird, who is a big Norse loving Norwegian MMA fighter. I'm like, he's not summoning some baby. He's going to be summoning, some powerful, kind of figure. Actually, notably, the prime mention of cherubim actually doesn't suggest something too much, other than some appear in animal forms like their biblical namesakes. Meanwhile, other ones like the shades of Stygia are like straight up, oh yeah, they're going to be like spectral robed figures, black dogs, crows, maggots, or obviously dead people, or sometimes deities of death. So there's a wide variety of that.
And Vicar last Friday was dealing with a supernal that was like a biblically accurate angel. There were multiple heads and multiple faces, lots of wings, lots of limbs, and that kind of thing. Weird summoned a Moira of Fate that was basically 3 entities: the maiden, the matron, and the crone. So there's lots of room for imagination there,
and a few more angles in which culture can jam in there.
Mm-hmm.
2 things we haven't really talked about are, you have mentioned paradox and quiescence, which sound like kind of magical control throttle things. What is paradox in Mage the Awakening, and what is quiescence?
So paradox is the backlash for casting magic. It's actually a nice short list of things that cause it. One is overreaching, with a reach being a capital R. If you try and cast as if you were a master at this spell, then you're going to get a little bit of paradox, and that's its exact value is going to go up as your gnosis increases. So if you have a higher gnosis, you get slapped with more paradox for the same amount of overreach. You also generate it from having provoked paradox previously, or casting in front of sleepers. Individual number of sleepers does not increase the paradox, but gives it the fun little dice tricks. So re-rolling 8s, re-rolling 9s. I did that backwards. Or in front of a huge group of folks, re-roll all the dice that didn't come up as successes the first time around. So you're very likely to get a paradox in that case, but because it doesn't actually increase your paradox beyond 1, you could actually create a really, really big paradox pool, but because you threw a bunch of mana at it to reduce it down to like 2 or 3, oh no, it's got the rote quality, so it's going to roll 2 or 3 dice, and it might come up with 3 successes, but that's still just 3 successes versus, if you hadn't spent the mana, potentially 6, 7, 8.
Okay. And rote in this case is lowercase r. That is a term of
Correct.
art used in New World of Darkness to describe any case where you're doing something that your character's done a bunch before or has a high likelihood of succeeding, where you just re-roll any failures once, right?
Correct. Mm-hmm.
Okay, got it. And you made mention of the 9 again and 10 again rule, or sometimes referred to exploding 9s or exploding 10s. Okay, and quiescence?
Quiescence and dissonance are the 1-2 punch of the lie that sleepers have to deal with. Quiescence is basically, wow, that was a cool magical thing. Whoops, I've forgotten it. Literally at the end of a scene, whatever they remember saying is tweaked in their head, so it makes sense with their worldview. And so they may, have seen fireballs being thrown, and they come back and they may completely not remember that they saw a bunch of mages throwing fireballs, or they may recall it as a bunch of fire jugglers in the streets. They remember it wrong, and if you push them, you can get them to remember. Then they have a breaking point again, and then they forget that they remembered again at the end of the scene. So it's a very, very constant issue for sleepers. Dissonance is the fact that they, because of their disbelieving magic, air quotes there, eventually anything that is supernatural will get worn down. Supernatural in the arcane supernal sense will eventually get worn down and go away. So they could see spirits or vampires or anything like that, and they're not affected by dissonance. But as soon as you do something like cure cancer, eventually that cure will go away and the cancer will come back. That's one of the questions of why can't they just do this, that, or the other? If they recognize that this thing has magically happened, then it will wear away. Said mage that goes into the closet with a big block of lead and comes back out with a block of gold, if that sleeper is not able to put together, or is able to put together that same lead block is that gold turn, and it's just changed, over time, that gold will get worn down until it becomes lead again. The spell potency gets worn away, and poof, it's back to lead. And that's where you get into training people to believe in magic. So hopefully they don't recognize it, and maybe it'll work. It doesn't ever work that way, though.
So it sounds like there's kind of magical governors, as there were. So it sounds like paradox in this case is kind of from your grasp being beyond your reach, of kind of overflexing, as it were, more so than something the surrounding world pushes down on you.
That's one aspect of it, but the casting spells in the presence of unawakened or non-supernatural beings is another source of it that's separate.
And that kind of looks like traditional paradox. What does incurring paradox look like? And from the sounds of things, incurring paradox is not mutually exclusive with your spell still working.
Correct. You have 2 things that can happen with paradox. You can either release it and let it just go and do stuff, which is bad, but that will effectively change your spell depending on the number of successes rolled on the paradox. So you can change targets or make this spell bigger, make the spell smaller, things like that. And that's up to the DM, the storyteller, to adjust based on the number of successes, and will penalize the die roll. So it may make it harder because, and that is a note, paradox happens before you actually cast the spell. So congratulations, you said, yes, I'm casting this. We're going to figure out what the paradox does. Then we'll figure out what the spell does.
Okay.
And then, of course, you could contain the paradox, which is basically shoving it into your own soul and basically trying to smother it, in which case you take the successes that the paradox rolled, usually, hopefully, just like 2 or 3, and you roll your wisdom to basically counteract success for success to reduce it down. Each success gives you a little resistant, bashing wound resistant, meaning that it can't be accelerated and magically healed. It's just going to come back normal, which generally speaking is 15 minutes on a bashing wound. So it's not terrible unless you've been getting beat up and it becomes a resistant lethal wound. And that does not affect your spell. If there are leftover paradox successes, though, after your wisdom roll, the paradox infuses your nimbus, your soul. It gets into you and is thereafter going to mess with your spells, not necessarily in a overtly negative way, but it's something that you're going to have to deal with. Like one of the classics is the Abyssal Imago, which is basically going to force you to take additional reach in order to actually cast a spell.
And with that, I have a few listener questions. J Mags asks, Terry, how was your experience playing an Awakening one-shot? And I'm going to say it was a lovely taste. It is a place I'd like to visit again. I miss the beautiful straitjacket that is Paradigm, but I imagine with a little bit of time that is something I would get used to. I like the fact that there didn't appear to be an Ascension War, that you can kind of have these Indiana Jones run around and find shit mysteries without breaking the themes of the game. And I literally own every Mage the Awakening book, so over time I will hopefully be able to fill in those gaps in knowledge. Sure. So World Jumper asks, is there anything from Ascension that you would like to steal for Awakening, and vice versa? My quick answer is the first thing I would steal are Nimbuses. I just think they're way more flavorful than Resonance and way more interesting. I'd probably steal Mage Sight and maybe the entire damn casting system if I had a long weekend to try and make it work. I know that, again, I am not familiar with Awakening and you may not be super familiar with Ascension, but is there anything from Ascension you're like, oh, that's kind of neat?
A lot of the traditions would work well as legacies in Awakening. So I might look through and make some custom legacies based on those.
I think Akashic is actually one of the legacies. I think we actually have it. I think so, yeah. I would totally steal some stuff like that. The Technocracy would actually make a very, very cool free council series of legacies. You could probably do one for each of the, what do they call them?
Conventions.
That's them. Yeah, definitely stealing some of the legacy stuff. Definitely not interested in stealing the casting system. I started to realize, I started looking at some stuff and I was like, in order to teleport somebody, you mean I have to have correspondence and life? No, thank you. But there is the whole idea of gathering paradox and it just kind of sitting on you is kind of an interesting concept. I don't know how well it would work in Awakening, but I kind of dig the idea of like it just sitting on you, because right now with paradox, once you leave the scene, the accumulated paradox doesn't do anything. Like it's gone. So some kind of long-term, you've been messing with paradox and now it's going to, last and have some lasting effect would be kind of interesting, that we kind of have that with like the Abyssal Nimbus and Abyssal Imago and stuff like that.
Next question. Can you explain to me how two characters casting the same effect may do it in very different ways?
I think we kind of touched on that a little bit with the way that you incorporate Yantras, and especially the Imago, like two different Obrimos that are trying to cast Celestial Fire as an attack spell might, view that in a different way. One might channel it through their body and use the force of their soul to set their enemy ablaze, and the other might call it as a literal pillar of fire from God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Imago is super customizable in the fact that it's just how does your magic appear, and one of the examples is like, calling down and your spell appears as an angel smiting down on somebody and then it's gone, as opposed to somebody who is very, very into the science side of being an Abrimos, literally just like, nope, I'm imagining your body literally overheating and then catching fire.
Is that something that only has narrative effects? As in
Yes.
it is? Okay, cool. Orange Lazarus from the chat asked a question about Mage the Awakening being responses to criticisms of Mage the Ascension. I'm going to say that that is beyond scope for the expertise we have here. Again, we're going to try and talk to a dev at some point. But another interesting question is, now that you've played the system a bunch, is there anything that you would want to change about it if someone tapped you on the shoulder and said, hey, we'd like you to help us with Mage the Awakening 3rd edition?
Yeah, there's a few little bits and bobs that are in there that I've spent some time thinking about. Arcane duels. We just ran one in our last session, actually, and I was like, damn, this is not as interesting as I thought it was going to be. And it kind of just ended up two people just throwing pools of dice at each other. Narratively, it was very cool. You get to describe this very creative, Merlin sort of casting of spells, but it really ended up just coming down to just throwing dice pools back and forth at each other. So creating some different systems or subsystems, I guess, for Arcane Duel. And I know, what was the other one we were thinking
Focused Mage sites.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. The Focused Mage site and Arcane Duels are basically, we're going to keep throwing dice at this until it breaks.
Yeah.
And that kind of falls a little flat. Narratively, it can be handled very cool. In terms of mechanics, it's kind of bland.
Does that fit into my general rule of anytime a character rolls the same dice pool more than twice in a row, it is officially boring?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. In the case of like the Arcane Duel, one of the players basically could have kept rolling manipulation plus life or manipulation plus death, whichever. They would have been equivalent pools over and over and over and over again. Fortunately, she's not nearly the metagamer and power gamer that I am, and so decided to change it up and not use the highest possible dice pool over and over again. But that's only because the Arcane Duel actually allows you to do that. In the case of Focus Mage site, you don't have a choice. You're rolling your Gnosis plus your Arcana again and again and again and again until it breaks or you fail.
Until you understand the universe or you get tired.
Correct.
That's that's great. That exhausts the questions that we had from listeners. Thank you to everyone who went to discord.me/mates the podcast and dropped a question in the channels there. We keep a channel for each upcoming show where I have enough notice to plan for it. But more importantly, your group does a live play. If we are curious about Mage the Awakening, where should we start and how can we find out more about the game and maybe what your community is doing?
Well, you can join us in Discord as well. That's yeetinto.space. It's an inside joke, but I guarantee once you've got a couple sessions watched, you will get it. But yeah, Yeet into Space takes you to our Discord. We have an entire channel called How Does This Work? So we are more than happy to see your questions and help you get into Awakening. The show itself is on YouTube, youtube.com/Occultists Anonymous. For the YouTube VOD, which I highly suggest because I actually edit those. But if you want to watch us on Twitch, that's twitch.tv/The Onyx Path, and that is Fridays at 7 p.m. Eastern. Oh, and I guess technically we have our Patreon, patreon.com/Occultists Anonymous, which is really, really boring. We prefer staylucky.club.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for your time. My final recommendation for the listeners is the Mage Translation Guide is a surprisingly good document in giving you a very quick and dirty explanation of what things map over, and more importantly, which don't. One of the things that came up in chat when we were talking about this episode is people are like, the bloody-blah in this game or just the bloody-blah in that game. And every time you say that, more or less, the answer is, not quite. And I like that because if there were direct analogs, then why the hell did they go through the process of making a new game and not just a new edition? Grab that, use our link in the show notes. We will get like 15 cents off of it, but in aggregate, that is enough to buy us coffee for a month. Thank you, everyone, for your time, and happy maging. I don't know, is there like a mage invocation? Do you have like a so say we all or anything?
I'm
Stay
sure
lucky.
the silver... Yeah, stay lucky. Yeah.
Yeah.
You've been listening to Mage the Podcast. You can subscribe to our show on Spotify, Anchor, TuneIn, iTunes, Google Play Podcasts, or the podcatcher of your choice. If you like us, please give us a review on the platform of your choosing. It helps new people find us. We have a Hop in Discord community at discord.me/matesthepodcast, and you can also give us your thoughts and feedback over email at matesthepodcast@gmail.com or on Twitter @matesthepodcast. If you'd like to support us and get a cool chat color in Discord, go to magethepodcast.com and click on Become a Supporter of Mage the Podcast. This episode is made possible from the support of our executive producers, which include Anders, Andrew, Brendan, Bryce Perry, Chris P., Chris Zach, Ira Grace, Justin, John Magnuson, Michael Parker, Richard Bat Brewster, and William. And here's a random limerick. There once was a donor named Justin, who was someone all had no distrust in. What spheres had you used? Their ST accused, but quite accurate were the rotes they were bustin'. Also, go to matesthepodcast.com for show notes and all our previous shows. And with that, go change reality.